Thank you so much. I'm Dr. Julie Goldstein. I'm the Rosh HaMidrasha. I'm the head of school at Amudim, which is a gap year program for young women, which fuses together traditional Talmud Torah and modern scholarship. It really offers the best of what modern scholarship has to offer. It's a very expansive, far-reaching, and I would say intellectually honest, nuanced, deep dive into Jewish texts and Jewish ideas. My doctorate is from NYU in medieval theology and Judaism and Christianity. And what else can I tell you about myself? I love to think deeply, to think philosophically, to look at history from the perspective of mentalite, of people's mentalities, and to look at Jewish intellectual history. And so we're going to do a little bit of that together as new people come in, and I admit them. So sometimes when you see me, stopping for a second, it's because I'm admitting new people in. Okay, we're talking about Isaac's ashes. Medieval Ashkenaz confronts the Akedah. It's apropos of this time of year that we're talking about the Akedah because we read the story, we read the narrative of the Akedah on the second day of Rosh Hashanah. The title of this talk it brings to mind Frank McCourt's 1996 novel Angela's Ashes, right? Which traces the impossibly awful, wretched journey of a family holding on for dear life. You remember that? They turned it into a movie, right? And Angela is a woman, a mother who many times in the memoir sits and stares numbly at ashes, right? In a fireplace, in a furnace, falling from cigarettes. There's that motif over and all symbolic of her too often gaze at the worst ashes of all, those of her children who had died, right? And it's those ashes that make the memoir painful, sometimes too painful to read. The death of a child is a human experience that we want nothing to do with. And the sorrow is sometimes more than anything, that we can bear. And it's the emotional unbearableness of even imagining the death of a child, as well as other practical considerations that ultimately make the Akedah an extremely troubling narrative within Tanakh. And so on a very basic level, Chazal, we're not the first ones to be troubled by the notion that God tested somebody so cruelly, right? In order to test your love for me, I'm going to ask you to give me the most beloved thing, your child. That's how you're going to show that you really love me. To give away or to give up your prized possession. It seems like a really, really cruel kind of test. And even just the implication, even though it's a story of child sacrifice in potentia, a potential child sacrifice, it's not actualized. We have to remember that. Still, at any moment within that story where there's an implication that somehow child sacrifice is desirable, that God wants it, that in itself is a troubling kind of notion. And the famous 18th century Danish philosopher and theologian, Christian theologian, Soren Kierkegaard, sees the heroism of Avram Avinu, of Abraham, precisely in the incomprehensibility and in the troubling aspects of the Akedah. He says on so many levels, the Akedah absolutely ran against common sense and threw Abraham into chaos. On an ethical plane, you don't kill anybody, no less your child, and the child that you love. So it didn't make ethical sense, says Soren Kierkegaard. It didn't make rational sense. It didn't make sense, from the point of reason, because in the parak right before, God had promised Abraham that his son would give him a great nation, would bear many children. So it kind of boggled the mind from the point of reason that now he should be charged with slaughtering his son. And it didn't make almost like kind of like emotional sense, right? To have to give up this prized, most treasured possession, if you could call a child a possession, this most beloved entity, which was his child. To take your son, your only son, the one that you love. And in order, Soren Kierkegaard says, in order for it to have been a real test, it couldn't have been that at the moment that he raised that ma'achelet. Ma'achelet is not the same thing as a sakin. Sakin it's a generic word comes from the word sakana. It's a dangerous object. A ma'achelet, which is the word that's used in the Torah for the device that was put at Isaac's throat, it comes from the shorash le'echol, right? Ochel, which is an annihilator, a consumer, right? The moment that he held that ma'achelet, that consumer, that annihilator, that knife, that slaughtering knife, to slaughter his son, says Kierkegaard, he had to love him more than he's ever loved him before, or else it would have made the test a little bit easier, right? If he hated him in that moment, it's a little bit, not to say, it's okay, it's easy to kill somebody if you hate them, but he had to, says, just to give it a little bit extra oomph, Kierkegaard said it had to not make emotional sense. And in order for it not to make emotional sense, in order for that moment to be the most paradoxical, chaotic, incomprehensible moment, in order for it to be a true moment of absurdity, he had to be at the epitome of his love for his son, so that the slaughter of his son would run counter to that love. So this is quite a test. The entirety of monotheism, because this is the beginning. This is the first real narrative within the Torah that sets off the rest of Jewish history, the recognition by at least the first person who recognized it, of monotheism. And the first source that you have on the sheet, it's the Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer, sees the Akedah as the foundational narrative within Jewish consciousness, within Jewish history, and within the Jewish experience. It's a famous midrash that tells us, Rav Chananya ben Dosa Omer, Oto ha'ayil shenivra bein hashmasho lo yatsa mimeno davar levatala. Not 1 ounce, not one aspect of the ayal that was taken, the ram that was taken instead of Yitzchak, was wasted. Right? Afaro shel ayil hu yisod al gabei hamizbeach hapnimi, gidei ha'ayil elu asara naval shel kinor shaya davim melagim bahem, oro shel ayil hu ezor matnav shel Eliyahu zichrono levracha, etc., etc., etc. What this midrash does is tell us, in a very artistic way, because that's what midrash is. It's trying to glean as many meanings from the text as possible, and it's not coming to report. It's not coming, newsflash. Here's information that the Torah didn't tell you, and we were there, and we know this information. It's trying to add a dimension. It's trying to add a theological, to try to glean a theological message from the Akedah, and it tells us as follows: that all parts of the ram that Abraham slaughtered instead of Yitzchak were used throughout Jewish history. The skin of the ram was used for the loincloth that Eliyahu Hanavi wore, and the sinews, the veins of the ram, were used for the strings of David HaMelech's harp, and the horns of the ram were used at Matan Torah and will one day be used at Yemot HaMashiach, when the Messiah comes. It's almost like as if you were walking in the Met and you saw a representation of the Akedah, where sprinkled across, I don't know, a kind of like a scene of all of Jewish history, are little pieces of the Ayal, right? What's the artist trying to say? What's the artist or the midrashist trying to say by painting this picture, by telling us that various parts of the ram were used throughout Jewish history? What I see this artist saying is essentially that the Akedah put into motion the unfolding of the rest of Jewish history. Something was very foundational, and the Akedah is going to rear its head You want to call it a pretty head or an ugly head, whatever you want. But the Akedah is going to it's going to re-enter the scene and resurface throughout Jewish history. It's going to be there at the Holocaust. It's going to be there at the erection of the Beit HaMikdash and at the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash. It's going to be there at every holiday, and it's going to be there at Yom HaAtzmaut, and it's going to be there throughout Jewish history. It's going to follow the Jews. So it was at Matan Torah, and in the future, it's going to be at the time of the Messiah. This is a foundational, at least what I hear this Midrash saying, is that this is a foundational story, even though it's unbelievably troubling, and it's unimaginable. It's hard to fathom, and it's almost blasphemous in its kind of acceptability of even the notion that somehow child sacrifice is desirable. And so that's why it's not so surprising that early rabbinic literature, all the way to modern literature, modern rabbinic literature, tries to kind of like downplay the child sacrifice motif and to kind of explain it away, and not to whitewash it per se, but to just make sure that we never have the havamina, that we never think for a second that God ever really contemplated really having Avraham Avinu go through with it, right? So we have on the source sheet Tanit 4a over here, right? It's actually this piece is actually, this Talmudic passage is actually one of the earlier kind of commentaries on the Akedah. And it says as follows. It's commenting on actually a part of Yirmiyahu, a part of Jeremiah, where Jeremiah is castigating and criticizing the Jewish people and the nations. And it says as follows: Uktiv asher lo tziviti. The Gemara interprets each phrase of the verse, which I did not command, right, as follows: Asher lo tziviti v'lo dibarti v'lo alta ali bi. Asher lo tziviti ze beno shel Musha melech Moav shne'amar vayikach beno habachor asher yimloch tachtav ya'aleh olah. V'lo dibarti ze yiftach v'lo alta ali bi ze Yitzchak ben Avraham. It goes through this verse, breaks down this verse where God is saying, I did not command something. And it says, when it says in this verse, I did not command, it's referring to the king of Moab, King Mesha, who sacrificed his son. It's referring to Jephthah's daughter, who was slaughtered and who was sacrificed. And it's referring to Isaac ben Abraham, who was also brought up, right? So you get this sense from Chazal in this passage that they really want you to know that God never really wanted a sacrifice, and Avraham Avinu is put in the same category, bless you, as Yiftach and the king of Moab, as like people who almost engaged or who did engage in this horrendous act of child sacrifice that was never God's intention, right? And here's another interesting midrash, a really beautiful one, almost like a gaslighting midrash, if you will. Okay, it's one of my favorites because it's so manipulative almost, right? It says as follows: Amarav Acha. Okay, this is the Midrash Rabbah Breshi, right? Amarav Acha Af ed lenecha sichot. Acha tells us that there was a discourse, that there was a conversation between Avraham and God, okay, in the kind of like aftermath of the command for the Akedah, right? And whenever you have rabbis telling us about conversations that they weren't there for and they couldn't have known happened, it's really they're using this conversation as they're the mouthpiece, right? They're using Abraham as a mouthpiece to voice their own thoughts. This is the conversation they would have had with God if they were at the Akedah, So they say as follows: Abraham says to God, yesterday you told me he's going to make me a great nation. Just last parak, you told me Yitzchak's going to make me a great nation. And then you came and told me that I should take my son, my only son. Now you're telling me not to kill my son? Don't lay a hand on the boy? You're driving me crazy. right? That's essentially what the Midrash is saying. Avram came to God and said, you're driving me nuts. First you tell me this, then you tell me the opposite, then you tell me the opposite of that, right? Amar lo HaKadosh Baruch Hu, God responded, Avraham, lo achalel briti, ve'et briti akim et Yitzchak. Avraham, I'm going to keep all my promises to you, okay? And I'm going to keep Yitzchak around. B'sha'ah she'amarti lecha kach na et bincha v'gomer, the moment that I told you, take your son, your only son, the one you love, etc., etc., umotzai svatai lo ashaneh, I did not change anything that I had uttered to you. Nothing changed in any of my contracts or any of my promises. Ki amarti lecha shchatehu, lo ha'elehu. Did I ever tell you to shecht him, to slaughter him? Lo ha'elehu. I told you bring him up. Asiktme achte. You brought him up, now bring him down. And it's true, if you look in the Pshat, God never says slaughter your son. He says bring him up. Ha'alehu. Technically, that's what he says. Now, you and I both know that an olah is a carbon, right? It's a sacrifice. And Abraham knew that too, right? But this is why I say it's kind of like gaslighting and manipulative. The Midrash has God kind of like takes the whole child sacrifice thing out of God's list of intentions, right? By having God say, I have no idea where you got this from, Abraham. I never told you to slaughter. All I told you was to bring up. You brought him up, now bring him down. Done. You're nuts, Abraham. I don't know where you got it from, right? And we both know that he got it from the connotation and the meaning of the word ha'alehu, which definitely means sacrifice, right? So what the Midrash does, and we're trying to see kind of like methodologically speaking what this Midrash is doing, I asked myself, what compelled the rabbis to say this, to have a gaslighting God, right? And what I would assume, seeing this kind of like pattern within rabbinic literature, that the rabbis were uncomfortable with the notion that God had asked for a sacrifice. And so they made it into a non-sacrificing narrative, where God didn't really ask for a sacrifice. God just asked for Yitzchak to be quote unquote brought up, right? And then there's Rav Kook, okay, because I want to take you to the modern period too, because this is throughout Jewish history. The Jewish rabbinic tradition on the Akedah tries to water down or minimize or mitigate the force of the child sacrifice motif within the Akedah, right? And Rav Kook is so brilliant. I was like, my mind was blown when I saw Rav Kook, okay? And Rav Kook is very obtuse, very hard, uses flourishes and very flowery kind of writing. And so we're not even going to try to read it in the Hebrew. It would just take, too much time. Although I'm happy to with anybody afterwards. You want to crack your head over Rav Kook's flowery writing. But basically, he tells us, and just a little bit of background information. It's so beautiful. Okay, if you've never heard this before, I just it's worth it. If you're thinking about leaving now, don't leave till after we talk about Rav Kook. Okay, we'll get to the medieval stuff too, but this is like really something. Rav Kook is aware and is invoking two famous midrashim about Abraham Avinu that tell us about two different sides of Abraham's character. There's the famous midrash about Abraham as a little boy smashing the idols in his father's shop in order to teach his father, in order to have his father come to the epiphany, discover on his own the stupidity of idol worship, right? If you recognize the story, essentially Avram's father has a store where he sells idols, and one day he goes on a trip. He leaves, and Abraham, who's already drawn conclusions about the one and true only God, wants to teach his father that idol worship is stupid. So he smashes in a rage of like passion, right? He can't believe all these idols, and his father subscribes to this and submits to this, and it's so dumb. And in like a tumultuous, passionate fervor for the one true God, he smashes all the idols in his father's shop, and he takes the stick or the bat or whatever that he used to smash the idols, and he puts it in the hand of the one idol that he didn't smash, which is the biggest idol in the shop. And then his father comes home and says, oh, what happened? Oh my gosh, all the idols. And he says, well, the big idol smashed all the little idols. And his father says, well, that can't happen. Idols can't smash. They don't have any power or they can't smash, their subordinates, or it's like, yes, then why are you worshiping them, Dumbo, right? And so that's that for Rav Kook. That midrash represents like the emotional, the passionate Abraham. That's the emotional side of Abraham. That's the Abraham Avinu who has a real passion for God. And then we have other midrashim that tell us about a rational Abraham, the rational side of Abraham, that he's a scientist, that he looked around the world, almost like he did experiments. He looked at natural phenomena. He looked, astronomically speaking, at the sun and the moons and the heavens and whatever. He looked at the oceans. He looked at the seas. He looked at the world as it is, and he determines that the world is unbelievably complex, beautifully complex, and so complex, has such an intricate design that there must be a designer, right? This is the clockmaker, the watchmaker approach towards God's existence, right? It's the teleological approach to God's existence. It's the theory of intelligent design. He drew conclusions. He drew a teleological conclusion about God's existence through his scientific inquiry, right? His look at the natural world. That's the rational, scientific Abraham, okay? Now, the pagans who were living at Avram's time, it was the cultural and religious setting in which Avraham Avinu was groomed and in which he grew, was one of raging passion. The pagans, actually, Rav Kook, the first chief rabbi of Israel, we're talking about Rav Avram Yitzchak HaKohen Kook, talks almost like complementarily, right, in praise of the like religious fervor of pagans. They were so enamored and so tumultuously infatuated with their gods that they were willing to do what? You all know where I'm going with this. Sacrifice their children, right, in this ancient Near Eastern ritual called Molech. And this is what Rav Kook says. Okay, I'm just going to move you guys over. You're actually on my source. Okay, on my screen. The primitive addiction to a captivating idolatry, which primitive man saw as the most important thing of all, to the extent that it vanquished parental mercy and made cruelty to children a fixed feature of the worship of Moloch, sprang from the murky perception deeply embedded in man's heart that our most treasured possessions are nothing in comparison to God. There was like a beautiful, deep, profound religious impulse that was expressed through Molech. They were unwaveringly committed to their gods and realized that love, that bespoke that our most treasured possessions, our children or whatever, are nothing in comparison to God. And so how does that fit in with the Akedah? This is what God wanted as he was introducing monotheism to the world. He wanted that religious ardor not to be diminished. He wanted the same passion that the pagans expressed toward their gods. He wanted that to be part of Judaism. And he knew that Abraham had a tumultuously passionate, emotional side to him. And so what he did in the Akedah is as follows. He said, Abraham, can you conjure up that emotion? Can you conjure up that same passion for me as your compadres have for their gods? Can you be as full of passion for me as they are? And Abraham, who's that same little boy, he's not a little boy at the Akedah, but inside, he's that little boy who had smashed all the idols in his father's shop, says, yes, I want, that's the only way that he knows in his milieu, in his cultural milieu, that people know how to express their desire for their God. That is the only way that they know. That is the best way that they know, is through child sacrifice. And it would almost be an embarrassment if Avraham Avinu wasn't able to bring up a similar passion for his God, this new God or whatever it is, right? For the one God that his peers are able able to bring up for their gods. And so God says, can you bring it up? Is it bubbling? Will you give me your child? Will you give me your son, your only son, the one that you love, like they're giving their children, to their gods? And Abraham says, yes, absolutely. And he's like almost, at the climax of his passion for God, and he's holding that annihilator, that ma'achelet, at the throat of his child, ready to do what all of his peers have done for their gods. And then at that moment, God says, wait, stay your hand. Why? Because this new religion, right, monotheism, is not only going to be about passion, but it's going to be about reason. Passion is going to be tempered by ethics, by human morality, by goodness, by your scientific side, by your rational reasoning side, that I also know is a part of your persona, of who you are, of your personality, right? And so for Rav Kook, the moment of test was not, will you slaughter your son? But it's, will you stay your hand? Will you not slaughter your son? That was the moment that Abraham says, I will not slaughter my son, because I'm a reasonable being, right? I have reason, is the moment that he passes the test, not when he says, yes, I'm willing to sacrifice my son, right? So what Rav Kook does there, like the rabbis before him, is he makes the whole test not about child sacrifice, but about lack of child sacrifice, about staying of the hand. It's a minimizing of the central motif of child sacrifice, which is really kind of fascinating. And so all of this is almost by way of introduction to say that I know we have like half an hour left, right? Something like that. That from the very beginning of interpretation of the Akedah all the way into the modern period, Chazal, rabbis, Rishonim, Achronim, you name it, have tried to kind of take out the sting of child sacrifice from the Akedah story because they find it very troubling. And yet there's one period in Jewish history where not only is the motif of child sacrifice kind of more acceptable to the rabbis, but it's embraced full force like it has never been embraced before and will never be embraced again. And that's in medieval Ashkenaz, okay? That's in, again, moving you guys over, that's in the time period in Jewish history, which basically starts, if we're gonna be kind of crudely give a periodization to it, around the year 1000, around the Rhineland, the Jews living in France and Germany, and their exegesis, their parshanut, their commentary on the Akedah runs wild in a way that I had not really ascertained, I had not seen before I actually really concentrated on it in my own studies, right? When I was studying the Jews of medieval Ashkenaz, they take a really startling turn. And you see here, I give it away, spoiler alert, I highlighted this section of the source sheets, highlighting child sacrifice, okay? So if you start with Rashi, okay? One of the, I guess, potentially the most famous medieval exegete, we see Rashi doing a very strange thing. He says as follows, Tachat beno, instead of his son. He's making a commentary, he's commenting on that phrase, seemingly a superfluous phrase, that the ayal, the ram, was slaughtered Tachat beno, right? It's seemingly extraneous. Rashi is going to say that it's not a superfluous indication that Isaac was replaced, but that Avraham Avinu prayed this phrase indicates that Avraham Avinu prayed that non-sacrifice, because that's what happens in the Akedah, it's a non-sacrifice, should be seen as an actualized sacrifice of his son. Tachat beno, me'achar shekatuv v'ya'alehu le'olah, and it invokes that same midrash, v'ya'alehu le'olah. It's kind of the one of v'ya'alehu, the same midrash that tried to whitewash the Akedah and minimize child sacrifice. He says, Lo chasar hamikra klum. Mahu tachat beno al kol. What does it mean, tachat beno, that the ram was slaughtered, whatever, instead of his son? Al kol avodah she'asa mimeno haya mitpalel. Every single thing that Abraham did to the ram, at every turn, when he was, I don't know, slaughtering it, releasing its blood, skinning it, whatever it is that he did, everything, every twist of the knife, whatever, haya mitpalel, he would pray the Omer Yehi Ratzon Shetehezo, ki ilu haya asuya bibni. Please God, please God, please God, please see this as if I'm doing this, as if I'm cutting this piece of skin, as if I'm squeezing out this blood, as if I'm removing this hair, I don't know, whatever it is that he was doing. Please, I beg you, please see this as if I'm doing it to my actual child. Ki'ilu b'ni shachot, ki'ilu damo zaruk, ki'ilu hu mufshat, ki'ilu hu niktar v'na'aseh deshen. Right? Please, I want you, I'm begging you, I'm praying that Yehiratzo, that this is happening to my actual, to my son, and not just to a ram, right? When I saw that, I was like, whoa, Rashi, that's the first time I'm ever seeing, a rabbi, a sage, kind of really want to embrace, like almost like fight against the notion that child sacrifice didn't actually happen, and kind of reinforce the child sacrifice motif. And then if you move on kind of like towards the end over here, just skipping over, Umidrash Agadah Hashem Yireh. Akedah zo lisloach l'Yisrael b'chol shana. This is something, right? This is about us invoking the Akedah on Rosh Hashanah every year, because we want slicha, we want forgiveness from God. So we're going to invoke it every year. Lisloach b'chol shana. Hitzilam min haparanut. It should save us from our iniquities. Kedei sheyomar hayom hazeh b'chol hadorot habaim bahar Hashem yira'eh afaro shel Yitzchak savur v'omed lekapara. Suddenly we have this motif, that this notion of Isaac's ashes, that God is going to look every year upon Isaac's ashes that are on the mountain or whatever. And when God looks at Isaac's ashes, this is all in Rashi, God will say, you know what, I'm gonna forgive the Jewish people. It reminds God about the sacrifice of the Jewish people. Well, in the pshat, in the basic meaning of the Akedah, there's no Isaac's ashes. Why? Because Isaac was never killed. So I feel like Rashi is going to great lengths to reinsert the child sacrifice motif, and to have this notion that there are actual ashes of Isaac that God can look upon. Going a little bit further, this is nuts, and maybe because I feel like we're going to run out of time. I don't know, whatever, we'll see. But as you go deeper and deeper into the Middle Ages, it gets crazier and crazier. So that we have the earliest known Tosafist, Rav Isaac ben Usher, a Tosafist from 11th century Germany, a student of Rashi, telling us as follows, that there is a midrash that states that the angels cried. This is over here, you see it? I'll just highlight. I was told I should highlight, and I haven't been doing it. I'm sorry. There's a midrash that states that the angels cried and their tears fell on the knife through which Isaac would be slaughtered, and Abraham wanted to strangle him. Abraham couldn't not sacrifice. God said, "Don't you dare do anything to him." But Abraham insisted, "I'll strangle him, and you'll grant Sarah another son named Isaac, in order to fulfill your statement to me that through Isaac I'll bring offspring." Is that okay? Right? God told him, "Don't slay your son." And he's like, wait, can please? Like, I really want to do it. And I know, like, maybe you're telling me not to slaughter him because you want to fulfill that promise that you told me in the last parak, that my son is going to, give me a lot of offspring. So how about, like, I slaughter him? Okay, so we're good, because that's what I really want to do. And then you'll give me another Isaac? Is that okay? Can I do that? Right? In order to fulfill your state, or make a new promise wherein Isaac's ashes will be collected before you as a remembrance for generations, as if he'd been sacrificed. So what Rav Isaac ben Usher is doing, we should be all happy. We have a story wherein the child is not sacrificed, and Rav Isaac ben Usher inserts into the story this conversation where Abraham is like, not only praying, like Rashi said, Yehi Ratzon, that it should be Ki'ilu, right? But Abraham says to God, like, please, like, don't worry, like, I'll forgive you. We'll figure out another way to fulfill your other promises. Just please let me strangle him. Can I just strangle him? Can I just make a little nick, right? Which is really bizarre, right? And then we have Rav Yehuda ben Shmuel HaChassid, who's a leader of Hasidei Ashkenaz, the Hasidim, as opposed to the Tosafists, who were like the halachists in the Middle Ages. We have the Hasidei Ashkenaz, who were the ethicists, a little bit superstitious also. And he's from 12th, 13th century Germany. And he says, where do we learn of the four Tkufot of the year from the Torah? For we find the Tkufa of Nisan, why all the water in the Nile turned to blood. The Tkufa of Tammuz, why? Because X, Y, and Z. The Tkufa of Tevet, I'm just skipping the Tkufa of Tevet. Why? When Yiftach slaughtered his daughter, all the waters turned to blood. And since it says every year for 4 days in the year, we observe all 4 Tkufot. Oh, but somewhere in here, the Tkufa of Tishrei. Why? Because when Isaac was sacrificed on the altar and Abraham reached out his hands and took the sword to slaughter him, the sword dripped with blood. Right? It's describing here in Rav Yehuda HaChassid explains that Jews refrain from drinking water during the equinox of the month of Tishrei to commemorate that Isaac was sacrificed on the altar, and when Abraham reached out his hand and took the sword to slaughter him, the sword dripped with his blood. Where'd he get that? That's not in the Pshat at all. Why is he talking about Isaac's blood being on the sword? Look at this funky one, okay? Judah ben Eliezer is also a Tosafist, and he says this is talking about when Rivka falls off the camel when seeing Isaac. This is later in life, right? Rivka, it says Vatipol me al hagamal in the pasuk, and this is what Judah ben Eliezer says in his commentary. Vatipol me al hagamal. This is a pasuk that has nothing to do with the Akedah. This is later on, right, in Isaac's life. But this is what he says. He's like almost obsessed with the Akedah. That he says, why did she fall from her camel? Lefi shera'ata Yitzchak shehaya ba migan Eden, v'haya holech kederech shehametim holchim ragleihem lamala. The reason why, I don't know where he gets this from. The reason why Rivka falls off the camel is because she sees Isaac emerging from Gan Eden, and he was walking the way that dead people walk with their feet on top, which is a medieval kind of like a myth or whatever, understanding that that's how the dead walk. It's like a medieval zombie, right? The dead walk upside down. And so on a pasuk that has literally nothing to do with the Akedah, he's like sitting there, Rav Yehuda ben Eliezer, and he's like, I wonder why Rivka fell off her camel. Oh, probably because Isaac had been killed at the Akedah, and it was because he was coming out of Gan Eden and he was doing a dead man's walk. Like, what? Why? Why does he think that? Why is it that throughout the Middle Ages, rabbis really reinsert as much as they can the death motif into the story of the Akedah, so that we have, and this is the last one for kind of like the last one that I have on the sheet. There's tons that we can point to that also does. It's the last commentary. It's the Shibbolei Haleket, which is Rav Skaya ben Avraham Anav, who's a 13th century Roman and German rabbi, and he says, כשנעקד יצחק אבינו על גבי המזבח ונעשה דשן, והיה עפרו מושלך על הר המוריה, מיד הביא עליו הקדוש ברוך הוא טל והחיה אותו. לפיכך אמר דוד, כטל חרמון שיורד על הרי ציון וגומר, כטל שהחיה בו יצחק, sorry, I just have to put down, שהחיה בו יצחק אבינו, מיד פתחו מלאכי השרת ואמרו, ברוך אתה השם מחיי המתים. Ostensibly, what this does, what the Shibbolei Halekha says, in an effort to show that the brachot of Shmona Esrei have always been in place, the Shibbolei Halekha says that Mechaye Hametim, the bracha of Mechaye Hametim, the revival of the dead, was said by the angels after the Akedah. Blessed are you, O Lord, who resurrects the dead. So that whole because he was resurrected, right? And we actually have, here's a nice handy, maybe you already saw this on the sheets that were sent to you or that you had access to. Here's a beautiful actual illustration. There's, we could look at visual midrash also. We really don't have so much time, but here's the Akedah. This is a miscellany from the Middle Rhine region, from medieval Ashkenaz, late medieval Ashkenaz, 15th century, right, 1400s. And here we have in the middle Yitzchak's neck kind of broken, actually being, broken, or the knife actually in his neck. And there are angels all on top. There's a whole story being told here, which we'll leave for another time. On the left side, I don't know if you can see my arrow, but on the left side, all the way on the left, is like a haloed figure. And a halo, not a halo like this, that we do in modern times, but a halo this way. It's a medieval kind of halo. It comes from the notion of Karan or Panav, right? That from the pasuk that talks about that Moses' face was radiating light when he came down the mountain, and so in the Middle Ages they would make a radiating face, a glowing face, this kind of halo around this way rather than this way. And this is, scholars see this on the right side is Sarah, or whatever it is. There are the angels. It's a whole Akedah scene. What's happening on the left side over here? What's this halo figure? What's going on? It's Isaac emerging from Gan Eden. It's him being revived. This is Isaac, the little boy Isaac, who's wearing the same clothes. To the left of the angel, to the left of the halo figure, is the dead Isaac, the one that was actually slaughtered at the Akedah. And then the one who's in white, who has a halo, is the resurrected one. Right? So even in their imagery, even in their pictures, their visualizations, their pictorial representations of the Akedah, for some reason in the Middle Ages, they see Isaac and they represent Isaac as actually having been slaughtered. And only in the Middle Ages. Now, of course, in modern times they don't. They go back to trying to minimize the child sacrifice motif. And so I don't know why. I don't know, we could leave here, I can just say, I don't know why, but I'm going to try to approach from a historical perspective a little bit of an answer as to why specifically in the Middle Ages, the Jews of medieval Ashkenaz, the Jews who are living under Christendom, see and represent Isaac as having actually been slaughtered. And they unabashedly insist on Isaac's ashes, right? I think it could come from a need for Isaac's ashes. Something in what was happening at that time made the Jews and the rabbis and the commentators and the exegetes have to represent the Akedah this way, as an actualized child sacrifice, or see the Akedah that way. And I think we can turn to two motifs within Christianity in order to understand this. The first motif, or the first idea, is Christian culture here, is the Christian reconceptualization of the Akedah. Christians in the Middle Ages mocked the lack of death, the lack of actualized death in the Akedah. And unlike earlier Christian theologians who equated Jesus with Isaac, they're the same. Jesus is Isaac, right? Paul did that, for example, in Pauline theology. Isaac is Jesus. In the 12th century, the Christian theologians in the Rhineland in the 12th century drew from a rich patristic reservoir of literature to recast Isaac as not equal to Christ, but as inferior to Christ. God really wanted the crucifixion. God wanted actualized slaughter. But the Jews, the Jewish people, Judaism was in such an infantile stage, such an immature stage, that Abraham couldn't bring it to full fruition. Couldn't bring it to the end, couldn't bring it to fulfillment of death, right? So that Peter Damian, for example, who is an 11th century Italian reforming, monk, Dante described him as a predecessor to Saint Francis, says as follows: "And as Isaac carried the wood on himself, so Christ carried the wood of the cross of the passion upon which he would suffer for our salvation on his shoulders. The two dismissed servants, right? The two servants on the side in the story signify the Jews, who, since they lived in a servile and carnal manner, did not understand the depth of Christ's humility, and therefore did not ascend the mountain, that is to say, the place of the sacrifice." The two who didn't actually go up on the mountain, the place of the actual sacrifice, represent the Jews who couldn't really, really be there, really fulfill the deed. And that donkey which Abraham used was the irrational foolishness of the Jews. That brute foolishness clearly carried all the sacraments. It carried all the sacraments. The Jews had it like within them, but like an irrational animal did not know what it carried. So the story of the Akedah is a story of the backwardness or the something lacking in the Jewish people, right? And then when we go, and so the Jews themselves, they're taking this all in. They know that Christendom is seeing the Akedah, in the Old Testament, as somehow inferior to the crucifixion in the New Testament, right? An unfulfilled request or command by God. That's one thing I want you to keep in mind. A second thing that I want you to keep in mind is that Christians also started to envision, child sacrifice within the contours of everyday life. They started to see Christ. They started to emphasize, specifically in the 12th century, the Christ child, the one that you see on the nativity scenes on people's lawns or whatever at Christmas. And they started to see the human being or God or whatever, Jesus, who had died on the cross, as the death of a child, right? As associated with child sacrifice. And so the Christians kind of reconceptualize the suffering Christ as an infant or a youngster. Here's an example of where they represent the suffering or dying Christ child at the altar at Mass. This is Adam of Einshem. He is a medieval 12th century English monk and a chronicler and a writer, and he says as follows. We won't read the original Latin. He says, when in the course of the service, the bishop had reached the place where it's customary to consecrate the host, which has already been raised to be turned by the words of consecration into the body of Christ, that's the Eucharist, God in his mercy deigns to open the eyes of a certain clerk and show him Christ in the likeness of a small child in the chaste hands of the venerable and holy bishop. Although the cookie, the cracker, the Eucharist, turned into, right there in front of the congregation, turned into the Christ child, right? Although very tiny, the child was very lovely and of a supernatural brilliance and whiteness beyond man's imagination. The clerk who saw this not unnaturally felt great devotion and compassion and wept continuously from the time of the elevation until he saw it elevated once more to be broken into 3 portions and partaken of. Just imagine this. According to Adam of this monk, they're in church, in Mass on Sunday, the wafer, the cracker, turns into the Christ child, and because it has to be broken so that each worshiper can then take a piece of the cracker on his tongue. You've seen this maybe in movies, or I don't know if you've been to a Mass, right? The bishop starts to rip the limbs of the child, of the Christ child, and then put it into the penitents' mouths. So it's almost like they're cannibals, right? In the second elevation, he saw the Son of the Most High, born of a virgin in the same form as before, offer himself for the redemption of mankind. Okay, and in the same kind of thing, Alred of Ravoux, starts to talk similarly about the Eucharist. The Eucharist is a cracker, is bread, right? It comes, it's associated with Bethlehem. Beit Lechem, the house of bread, which is the manger, which is where Jesus was born. Bethlehem, the house of bread, is the holy church in which is offered the body of Christ, that is true bread. The manger in Bethlehem is the altar of the church. There feed the animals of Christ. In this manger is Jesus wrapped in swaddling clothes. The wrapping with swaddling clothes is the veiling of the sacrament. In this manger, under the species of bread and wine, are the true body and blood of Christ. Blah 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 blah. And that's why it makes sense that the wafer, the bread, turns into the body of Christ, right? Because it's in the house of bread that this little bread was born, And so the Jews in this time, medieval Jews, perceived themselves, they hear all this. They hear about Christians looking at the Akedah as a non-actualized child sacrifice. And they say, wait, hold up. It's fulfilled. It is fulfilled child sacrifice. We have Rashi saying, no. Abraham really prayed. No. It's just like I killed my son. Right? We have the Tosafists saying, like, no, Abraham begged, please, can I just make a nick? Can I just strangle him? And you'll make me a new promise, or you'll make me a new Isaac. And we have Afaro Shel Yitzchak, Isaac's ashes. The medieval Jews, hearing that they're seen as inferior, or maybe even kind of internalizing that having an inferiority complex, that somehow the Akedah is an inferior story to the crucifixion, reinserts the motif of child sacrifice in order to counter Christian claims that they're inferior. They're like, no, we did it. No, Abraham really did sacrifice. It was a crucifixion in and of itself, and we hear throughout Jewish culture, we're not going to go through any of these sources, Jews, beyond exegesis on the Middle Ages, beyond commentaries in the Middle Ages, Jews who were talking about other things in the Middle Ages, talking about their children's births, their children's circumcisions, fun, happy things, over and over and over again refer to children as sacrifices. They say, that the first thing that the first book that a child should be exposed to in the cradle, when a child is born, you put a mobile in the cradle, you put a doll in the cradle. I think nowadays they say don't put anything in the cradle. And they also say, you know what you should do? Put Sefer Vayikra by the child's head. Why? Because Sefer Vayikra is the book of sacrifices, and the child is analogous to sacrifices. It's like, right? They say things like Jacob Hagozer, in his manual for circumcision, says someone who offers his son to be circumcised in the morning is viewed as one who on that day brought the morning sacrifice, and the blood of circumcision is viewed by God as the sacrifice of the two sheep, right? Like all this talk about sacrifices, children as sacrifices, obviously through the Hebrew Crusade Chronicles, when they're talking about their children. This is a crazy, crazy source. Look at it on your own because I only have 4 minutes. But essentially, in the Crusade Chronicles, we have tons, when the Jews are giving eyewitness accounts of their experiences during the Crusades, they talk of their children who they sacrifice. They slaughter, Jews sometimes slaughter their own children. They write of having slaughtered their children during the Crusades in order to prevent them from being baptized. And you know what they named their children a lot? Yitzchak, right? It's like a motif, like probably their names weren't really Yitzchak over and over and over again, but they have, little Yitzchak over here. Rachel is slaughtering this woman. Rachel is slaughtering her children. One of them is named Yitzchak and runs away from her and says, mommy, mommy, oh no, actually Yitzchak says, okay. It was another one who says it's Aaron, her son Aaron, who says, no, please don't slaughter me. And she says, no, I got to do it, whatever. But the one who most submits, just like in the original story of the Akedah, is her son Yitzchak, who willingly submits. You'll just read this one here. This one is a short one. There was a certain young man named Rabbi Meshulam ben Rav Isaac. He called out loudly to all those standing there and to Tzipporah, his helpmate, listen to me, both great and small. This son God gave me. Listen to this motif. This is like a biblical motif in the Hebrew Crusade Chronicles in the Middle Ages. He says, my wife Tzipporah bore him in her old age. And guess what? His name is Isaac. Now I shall offer him up as did our ancestor Abraham with his son Isaac. Tzipporah replied, my Lord, wait a bit. Do not stretch forth your hand against the lad whom I have raised and brought up and whom I bore in my old age. Slaughter me first so that I not witness the death of the child. He then replied, I shall not delay even a moment. He who gave him to us will take him as his portion. He will place him in the bosom of Abraham, our ancestor. He then bound Isaac. It's an Akedah. It's a medieval Akedah, his son, and took in his hand the knife with which to slaughter his son and made the benediction for slaughtering. The lad answered, amen, and he slaughtered him. So over and over and over again, for some reason, Jews in the Middle Ages see their children as sacrificial material, talk of the slaughtering of their children as actualized akedot, whereas that old akedah, and Christians will tell you that old akedah is the unfulfilled, right? Unfulfilled command of God. These akedot here, we're the true Jews. We're the more religious ones, right? We actualize akedah. And I know it's very, very disturbing. And there's a lot more to say about this. And I say this talk is medieval Jews confront the Akedah. This is a very, very tumultuous era of the first crusade. And I think that in this tumultuous era, in the aftermath of the crusade, as Christian tolerance of the Jewish presence in Northern Europe began to wane and Jews' sense of stability began to crumble, Jews kind of affirmed the veracity of Judaism, the veracity of the Jewish Bible, of the Hebrew Bible, of the Old Testament, and demarcated between self and other through a polemical interpretation of Tanakh. This is polemics, what we've read, all of this exegesis, these commentaries in the Middle Ages. It's a polemical parshanut. And they saw their circumstances. I don't know if they conscientiously polemicized. I don't know if they said, you know what? Oh, Christians see us as inferior because we didn't actually do child sacrifice, so we're gonna like conscientiously insert child sacrifice. I think it was an unconscious thing, and even so, not conscious, that it's more like they saw the Akedah through the lenses of their own experiences. When they saw the Akedah, they saw actualized child slaughter because they were experiencing actualized child slaughter, right? And their experiences, it was reflected and refracted through their understanding of the Akedah. And really, when we speak this Rosh Hashanah, when you maybe you'll see the Akedah through a little bit of a different lens. Maybe you'll see the Akedah through a medieval lens. I should hope that as we approach Rosh Hashanah, we understand what we read in the Piskei Rabbi Eliezer all the way at the beginning, that the Akedah resurfaces throughout all of Jewish history. It is the beginning of a Jewish understanding of self, of a Jewish understanding of what God wants, of a Jewish understanding of rationalism versus passion, emotion versus reason, and how that all is going to play into the Jewish historical experience. And it's a very, very full, complex, and fraught narrative, which is at the end of the day invoked during Rosh Hashanah, because Rosh Hashanah is the beginning of the rest of history, right? And so just as the Torah starts off with this narrative, so the beginning of the rest of our lives starts off with us kind of wrestling with this narrative and what it means for us. So I hope that gives your Rosh Hashanah and at least your reading of the Akedah a little bit of meaning this year.